Hey everyone, welcome to the Ultimate Support Guide for Season 11. We'll be going over quite a few tips in this guide, including different support styles, different ways to play the map, and much more. By the end of this guide, you should have knowledge of how to play support at a master's level, which will hopefully enable you to climb on the role. So without further ado, let's get into the guide. To start us off, let's understand the different support styles and the characters that fit those styles. There are three main styles of support. You have backline or peel-oriented supports. This can consist of characters such as Khepri, Ganesh, Sylvanas, or even Iset. You have your midline supports. These are supports that sit mostly in the middle of the fight. This can be characters such as Yemoja, Geb, Atlas, Ymir, and Nox. And lastly, you have your frontline or engage type supports. This can consist of Athena, Kuzenbo, and Fafnir. Now, since midline supports consist of a lot of front and backline supports, we'll just be focusing on the two different supporting categories: engage or frontline supports, and peel or backline supports. Some examples of supports that excel in both are Ganesh and Maui. Ganesh can start a fight with his ult while still staying and peeling for his backline. Maui is also similar with his ult and his kit. Knowing all of this information, it's important to load into a match knowing what your support is primarily going to do best. In other words, engaging and being in their face, or peeling and enabling your backline. This should set your initial playstyle for the game. Now we can take this a step further and identify what best primarily fits the draft. For example, what does Ares do best? Well, Ares' main attraction is a cripple. His chains are really good at locking down anyone that has a dash, especially frontline, since most are dash-oriented characters. On top of that, he's very punishing towards characters that have no CC immunity in their kits, because he can easily pull their beads or pull them in with his ult. So you would want to pick him into characters like Thoth, Ullr, Hui, and Artio. However, on the flip side, since he has no mobility or leap, characters like Baron, Ymir, and Kabrakan are all very good into him. So you want to stray away from an Ares pick into those characters. Okay, so what about your comp? What's good with that? Well, if I have allies that don't have mobility or they're hyper carry characters like Jingwei, Thoth, pretty much anyone who would scale well late game, I might want to play more backliney and enable them, especially if the enemy has a lot of dive. So in this case, I might pick Khepri, Ganesh, or even Geb to help protect my carries against the late game dive. Also, I'll be getting into identifying who your carry is and why it's important later on in the video. But going back to this, now we have many options of what styles might be good for a game. So how do you choose? Well, it's completely up to you. Do you want to be more of an engager in that game or a backline enabler? You pick what's right for you and what fits the style you like to play the most. Just make sure you identify what character is going to play best in that game per your style. Okay, so now that we've established all of that, let's get into the actual gameplay mechanics of support. Let's start off with laning. As a support, you want to start off by pulling the purple buff. Your ADC will pull the green buff to group it up, and depending on your clear style, you'll drag it towards the lane as you clear it. Now we've gotten into the laning phase. How the lane is played out has many factors, the biggest of all being your matchup. Does your dual lane comp out clear, or does it outfight the enemy? This is something that you build up over time from just playing the game and paying attention. So I'm not going to be able to tell you how to play every single matchup you go against. That's going to be up to you to figure out. But I can give you some examples. Here are supports that I believe typically get the most pressure in lane versus supports that lack pressure. One of the common factors between supports that have a lot of lane pressure are typically 3+ damaging abilities, and the ability to self-buff, whether that's sustain or extra procs from the abilities. A few examples of this would be Sobek, Terra, and Sylvanas. On the opposite end of this, we have supports that don't get as much pressure, and some of them have an ability slot used up to buff or CC instead of damage, for example Geb and Ganesh. Now some of these can turn into pressure supports depending on who your ADC is. For example, Khepri can definitely get pressure if you have a winning ADC matchup. Okay, so now say we get pressure, what do we do with it? Well, we play for the farm. Shield buff is a ton of extra gold in XP, same thing with the single Harpy camp on the teleporter. And if nothing's up, force minions into their tower, because when the tower hits minions, the enemies get like 2 to 3 gold from those minions, instead of their full value. Also, you can kill enemy bastions which give 100 extra gold or 50 each if you're dual splitting it. Now, have you ever heard the term no risk, no reward? Well, that definitely applies here. You know their purple camp timer because it's about the same as yours, so if you have pressure, you better be invading that camp unless you know the enemy mid or jungler on the way. Being aggressive and pressing your lead will enable you to snowball. Yes, it is more risky, but there's no point in having pressure if you're not going to use it. If you're on the receiving end of this, say you have no pressure, be smart about how you farm. For example, say the enemy duo has a ton of pressure. They clear wave and go to shield buff, while the Harpy camp is up at the same time as shield buff is. So instead of contesting them for it, you can go right to the Harpy camp and clear that. Sure, it's not as much farm, but it's something. You just need to be able to cut your losses a little bit. Plus, you prevent them from getting that extra farm. It's the same thing as with your camps. If you know your purple's about to come up and they're out clearing you, you might have to sack a few minions to pull your purple back early to your tower to prevent the invade. And this is pretty much how you should be playing and thinking about the lane. Now that we understand laning, let's get into map play. There are a few ways to play the map. The first way is to rotate everywhere. This means playing all 3 lanes, but primarily farming from the mid lane. The second way is to sit in dual lane with occasional rotations to mid and solo side jungle, but getting your primary farm off duo. The third way is just to perma-sit in duo with no rotations at all anywhere until about 20 minutes in or so. Now, while all 3 styles are completely viable, I tend to use the second style the most, with more emphasis on sitting in dual lane. The reason for this is because aside from all the potential farm mentioned in the laning section we just went over, you're giving more farm to your mid laner because you're not splitting with them at all. From my experience playing this season, sitting in dual lane is best because you outpressure the enemy ADC, and even though you're splitting farm, you're gaining so much more farm in return that both you and your ADC will naturally be 2 to 3 levels ahead of theirs, especially if they're not receiving help from their support or jungler. And if their support is say sitting in mid, your mid laner should naturally be ahead of theirs because they're getting way more solo farm. Also, since gold is the only major objective on the map for the first 12 minutes or so, if the enemies are caught rotating to solo, then you guys can just do gold fury because you'll have pressure and more players. And if worse comes to worse and there's a big fight taking place in solo lane, just use the teleport to get over there. Typically, the playstyle I see from most lower level players, whether they main support or not, is the fact that they spread themselves thin and try to rotate everywhere, and in turn end up taking a lot of farm from their mid laners, which causes them to be behind. Because remember, if you're rotating everywhere, your primary source of farm from support's probably going to be the mid lane. Now, don't get me wrong, you're always going to have players complain whenever you're not somewhere in the enemy support is. But if you're being aggressive enough in dual lane, you should be winning the lane so hard, especially if the enemy isn't rotating, that you and your ADC can now make plays and alleviate pressure on the map. Also, make sure to be proactive with your rotations. And when you do rotate, make it be for a reason. Fight over farm, whether it's Gold Fury, Pyromancer, Mid Harpies, or even just the beacon. Make sure there's some reason for why you're fighting. With that being said, I'll always try to rotate for the beacon when it spawns at 12 minutes, and if the Gold Fury is down and Pyromancer's up, I'll refocus my attention around mid lane because that's where the next major objective is. Let's go over teamfighting next. This is going to piggyback off the different support types we talked about earlier. If you're an engage style support, then you'll be primarily focusing on diving their backline and trying to kill their carries with your solo and jungle, making it so your carries fend for themselves. The goal of playing this way is to kill their carries before their dive kills yours. Now, if the enemy has a backline support, this will be a lot harder since they have someone peeling for them. And this is where peel supports come in. Instead of diving, you're protecting your backline and trying to kill their frontline first. We call this playing front to back, whereas the other method is called playing back to front. There are some characters, however, that can engage first and then come back and try their best to peel. Athena is super good at engaging with her dash taunt, but her ult is also good for making a player super tanky. So one good method is to go in and start the fight, then ult whichever backliner is getting gone on. Other engagers like Bacchus probably want to start the fight and remain attacking the enemy backline, especially because he can do a lot of damage. So as you can see, different characters, even though they're engagers, can play the fight much differently. I'm not going to go over how every character plays, that would take forever, but I want to give you a few examples to reference how teamfights can be played out in different ways. Let's go over a couple backline supports next. Khepri wants to play behind or in line with his carries. This is because better players will hard focus him in a teamfight to either force his ult early on himself or cause him to make a mistake. Positioning with the carries also allows you to get a good ult off and put your carries in a safer position once they get ulted. Khepri's 2 also grants an ally hit with it 30% reduced damage taken for a few seconds, so you can make them very tanky just by using this ability on them. Maui can start a fight with his ult or his 1 and spam his 2 onto his allies to give them extra prots and movement speed. On top of this, if your carries are getting dove, you can use the stun as a form of peel or really any of his CC tools, even your ult. Terra can start a fight with her 2 and place her 3 down on her carries to buff and heal them. She can also ult both enemies and allies to place a debuff and buff respectively. Maui and Terra excel at playing in the middle of the fight. Those are just a few examples of how to play those supports in their correct positions. What I would advise is whenever you're playing support, ask yourself where you should be in a fight given your kit and what category you fall under. Do you want to engage, peel, or do both? See if you're being effective or not, and if you're not, switch it up until you are. Alright, let's go over how to build support. I often get asked what I mainly build on so-and-so, and the answer is it depends. See, the thing about support is you need to build for the current game. Other roles like mid and ADC typically have 1 to 2 set builds that they can do every game. But in support, it all depends on who you are, who the enemy is, what you need in the current situation, and so on. So instead of giving a set build, which wouldn't work anyways, let me tell you how to build, or how to think about building. Let's start off with starters. There are 3 main support starters, that is Benevolence, Sentinels, and Warflag. Benevolence I always build on backline supports because Compassion is the best tanky aura item for allies in the game, and since I'm always trying to stay with my backline, it makes sense to build this. In turn, you'll take a bit more damage, but because you're not hard frontlining, that doesn't really matter. What matters to you is making it as hard as possible for enemies to kill your allies. And with that being said, I will go into Heroism, which is the other upgrade for Benevolence, when I'm up against heavy CC divers like Thor and Tyr. The thinking behind this is that when Tyr failures to someone, they now get a shield and can absorb all or most of the damage. The same is true when Thor wants to poke with his wall and hammer, or when he dives with his ult. Naja is another character Heroism is good into because he has a lot of single target CC, and his whole kit is revolved around CC. Next up we have Sentinels. Sentinels is really good for dive supports like Bacchus, Kraken, or Athena, because Sentinels gives a lot of extra prots and supports want these prots to be tankier, since for the most part they'll be engaging and frontlining. The same is said for Warflag as well. Warflag gives nice prots, so it's really up to you which to choose in this case. I personally like building Warflag on Maui and Fafnir since it complements their kits, and I think this is a good transition into the rest of what to build. Typically, every game I'll go Thebes. I just think it's one of the best items in the game. Beyond that, I'll go items that help counter the enemy, ones that complement my kit, or ones that buff my allies. The best way to think about this is by some examples. On Fafnir, I like Warflag because it gives allies attack speed, and so does Fafnir with his 2. So you're complementing a portion of this kit. Maui's the same thing, but the movement speed aspect of Warflag. I usually do Warflag with Talisman of Energy, and I'll throw out my 2, and we're all zooming like 560 ms. That's what I mean by complementing a kit. How about countering? Well, say they have multiple auto attackers. Midgard is a fantastic item to go against that. Same with Witchblade. Crit? Maybe fit a Spectral in there. How about my allies? What helps them? Well, say you have multiple auto attackers. Shoguns and Talisman are both great to build. What if they say have an Ares and we don't have CC immune alts? Fitting in an Absolution may just save the game. They have 4 Fizz, Thebes and Sov go a long way. Or on the flip side, Thebes and Heartward really help versus 4+ magicals. See what I'm doing here? Building isn't as complicated as some might think, you just need to put a little thought into it. You need to know what all the items do and use that knowledge to build against your opponents and for your allies. Fitting in cooldown in MP5 might also be really good if you feel like you're lacking it. I've actually started building Breastplate on Capri's 2nd recently and it's felt amazing. The cooldown MP5 from that item let me fight so much more. So in the end there's no set build, but you have the knowledge and the tools to know how to build appropriately for that game. Now we're at the point in the video where we've gone over the bulk of how to play support, but next I just want to go over a few other side things that might help you out. The first is identifying who your carry is. Oftentimes what I like to do is see if I know a name or if someone is playing particularly well between my mid, jungler, ADC. You know how I said earlier that I like to sit in dual lane? Well, there's an exception to that. If I'm not vibing with my ADC or I just don't think my ADC is that good, then I'll tend to leave the lane much earlier. This is because even if I help to give my ADC a lead, they're still probably going to toss it or not even use it. And at this point, I'll go over to mid early or even roam a bit with my jungler if he's the one popping off. So it's important to identify who you think the carry for your team really is and enable them the best you can, because they're the ones that are going to utilize the lead best if you help them get one. Next is warding. You want to try to get high wards best you can. This means warding their back camps and even warding mid beacon if your mid isn't doing it. We all know what wards are, of course, but they do make or break games. By warding their camps, the best piece of info you can get besides camp timers are where the enemy jungler is going to be at, because this dictates how you and your teammates can play that side of the map. To expand upon wards, make sure you're getting either proximity wards or Raven wards late game. Both are good, but I always prefer proximity wards because it CCs targets by slowing them for a little bit and it also reveals them for 10 seconds. This is especially good into invis characters like Loki. There really is no reason to not go a proximity ward if you're against a Loki. The clips speak for themselves. The last thing I want to go over is body blocking. I've posted many clips on this and this video will not be complete without adding this in. Body blocking is what separates the men from boys. It's how I identify if a support is good or not. Whenever you're in a fight or lane, especially when your abilities are down, utilize your body as an obstacle. There's so many abilities and auto attacks you can block for your ally if you just get in front of them or hover between the enemy and your ally. This play can be the difference between winning or losing a fight. You need to be able to determine if the abilities coming at you can be blocked in the first place, and if so, get in front of it and absorb it for your ally. Especially in the late game, your carries are the ones doing massive damage, so your job is to keep them alive as long as possible, even if that means sacking your own life. Understanding this is also good for laning. Say you're against a Kuzenbo. When he tries to clear with his turtle, make sure you block most of the wave or even your ally from getting hit by it. This is also really good against Naja, who has a lot of abilities you can easily block. At the end of the day, the wins and losses can be determined by small plays. This is one of those mechanics you need to understand as a support if you want to improve and become the best support you can. Alright, well that's the complete guide. This one was on the long run, but there's a lot I wanted to cover, and I do believe if you stick to what I mentioned in this guide and you actually do want to improve, the tactics mentioned in this guide will help you become a much better support player. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out in the comment section. I'll do my best to answer them. Until next time everyone, see ya!